All right, we're live.
Nice.
Morning, Drew Kniffin. How are you?
I am great. Good morning, Drew Whitson. How are you?
Doing well. We are getting people ramped up, so we've got about 15 people online right now, and we'll wait a few more minutes to get them going. We are in our third interview series on the Like a Boss series. So we have been going kind of through the full process to help people understand what is the right way to help build a multifamily syndication business. And we've been trying to start with the people on the Nighthawk team to say who are doing this like a boss, who are doing this the right way. And I think it's great because Nighthawk Equity, by and large, is the vision for many of us who are looking to build a syndication business. You sort of built out processes and tools and assigned roles. And so to the extent we can learn from the things that have happened on the Nighthawk Equity side, we can start to model those best practices. So our first interview was with Garrett Lynch, who's the director of acquisitions. He helped us understand how to work with brokers, how to do underwriting, look at new markets. We spent last week talking with Bronson Hill, who is your sort of your investor, kind of the pre-purchase guy. He helps sort of find and qualify your prospective investors, best practices, and really how you communicate and get those systems involved. And today we're with Drew Kniffin, who is the president of Nighthawk Equity, who is going to sort of say, well, okay, what happens after we close? Like, what as you want to sort of manage this asset, manage your investors, manage your property managers, how do you do those things well? And Drew Kniffin and I certainly have a long history of making mistakes, and so I think you can learn some things from us. Drew, here's a little pop quiz question, Drew. How many deals have you and I been part of, either through deals that we've been partners on, joint ventures, syndications? What do you think? How many deals have we done over the last 5, 6, 7 years?
A dozen.
I did the math today. It was 18 deals. We've done 18 deals together.
Gosh, that's right. And some of them triplexes, right? And then some a lot bigger. Some of them syndication, not. But everyone has a story. Right?
Everyone has a story.
Prizes and things we've done wrong and lessons learned, for sure.
Yep. One of the things I tell my coaching students is that there is value to obtaining knowledge, but there is no replacement for the experience, right? You can read all the books on swimming and you can know everything about swimming, but you can't learn to swim till you get in the pool and do it. And so that's what I encourage people is just take an active role and execute on things and do things. Don't just listen to podcasts. Listen to our podcasts, listen to this information, but let this be a catalyst for you to go out and execute and find ways to put those things into practice. So,
yep, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, you and I have seen a lot of people who are phenomenal at gathering information, but they don't jump outside the nest, right? And so we want to coach people to jump outside the nest with sufficient information that they don't fall flat on their face, that fall out of the nest. But you got to do both. You have to learn and do.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. Well, let's jump into this. And you and I had a little bit of an outline, sort of brainstorming here. Talk me through what happens at Nighthawk. So you close on a deal. Okay, we're going to start from day one. Day zero, you got the deal closed, the money's in, boom. What's the next steps? What are the first things you do in the first week of ownership? What are some of the things that you want to do, make sure that are done well right out of the gate?
Yeah, so I'm going to think about this from the standpoint of what are the phone calls that you make to make sure that your systems are up and running from the very beginning. And what we've learned is if you fail to make these phone calls, if you fail to dot these I's and cross these T's, you'll pay for it down the road with sloppiness, and it'll consume up more of your time. So I think the first phone call, and in reality, it's a series of phone calls that you need to make, is talking to your in-place property manager. The one that you've instructed to come on site. And so you're going to talk to them on day one and simply say, how is day one takeover coming along? And you've actually already made a lot of phone calls with them leading up to takeover. So it'll be things like, do you have the rent rolls? Have you inputted the ledger into systems, right? So if there's a tenant that was behind by $200 the day that you took over the property, is that correctly noted in your system? Do you have a list of all the vendors, right? Who cuts the lawn? Who is the plumbing contact? Who does the termite service. Like, so you need to know all of those contracts. So those are going to be some things that you're going to make sure are correct. And then inevitably, there's going to be issues that come up in the first couple of days. Like, do you have all the correct keys? So that's going to be just a general, how is the turnover going phone call? And we've seen a lot of instances, and then there needs to be communication with your property manager, with the prior property manager, if in fact there's been a change in PM.
Right.
There will be drop balls, right? Because many tenants will say, "Oh, I paid the old guy rent this past month." We get that all the time, and we've seen thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of dollars be quote unquote lost based upon, or could be lost based upon whether there's a quick and clear understanding of whether that person in fact paid and whether there's receipts to verify that. So that's a detailed process.
Got it.
So that's like your first phone call. And then within that phone call, there's also setting up the cadence of communications with your property manager, the ongoing conversation about how is the property going, right? So you need to figure out what your key performance indicators are. What are the main things that you want to know and follow? Is it vacancy? Is it collections? Is it work orders? Is it notices to vacate? All these kind of things. And then you need to track those things, right? So sequentially, week by week, following up on them. So we can go into a lot more detail about how you do those phone calls with your property manager, but that's a very important first phone call to have.
Sure. What do you recommend after purchasing? How often should you be talking with your property manager about the performance of the property?
I mean, honestly, in the first month that we acquire property, we're talking daily.
Okay.
We're really talking daily to make sure that everything is going in the right direction. If things seem to be kind of going in the right direction, we might back off in that first month to the weekly phone calls. But there's a lot of stuff that we're just making sure goes well. It depends also on how, if you have a huge renovation plan, either for the interior of the units or the exteriors of the property, you may get a little bit more involved in that to kind of help move that along or to accelerate that.
Yep.
But it really is a pretty engaged conversation for that first month as you create the momentum, and then eventually it has a little bit more momentum of its own, right? It sort of sustains itself. But then once you get that going beyond month one, it's probably a once a week phone call to check up on it. I mean, you can kind of think of it like you go to your doctor once a year to check up on your health, right? All these different metrics, your heart rate, your height, your weight, all this thing. It's sort of like that with your property, but it's a weekly conversation that you're having.
That's great.
So,
okay. So you kind of launched your first cadence with the property manager. Who else do you need to talk to that first few days of ownership?
You need to talk to your accountant, right?
Okay.
You need to talk to your accountant and get everything set up cleanly in the books, right? So the accountant is going to take your closing statement from when you bought the property and basically do their magic. They're going to tie out every single penny to the different accounts that they have for the property. And your accountant is different than your bookkeeper and your property manager. So the bookkeeper keeps track of dollars coming in and paying vendors, but your accountant is the person that is going to eventually, at the end of the year, create your tax statements for all your investors. And so those two parties, your property manager and the controller within that, and your accountant are essentially the 1-2 punch of your accounting team. And, Drew, you and I have made the mistake of not putting those two in touch with one another. And then, number one, your taxes at the end of the year could either be inaccurate or come late or be more expensive to prepare, or all of those three, because you failed to put those parties together. And at the time of closing, when all the information was live and you had fresh access to all that information, and all the different parts of closing were fresh in your mind, if you don't do it then when it's 8 months later down the road and it's tax season, you're going to forget stuff. It'd be much more difficult for your accountant to put the tax information together, and it's just going to be an overall more difficult experience. So that conversation with your accountant will be very important to have. And another thing that's important to remember about it is, like, I'm not an accountant. Like, it's not my job to do it all. It's my job to know to pick up the phone and talk to the accountant and respond to his or her questions about what needs to happen to get the taxes right. So like they literally will ask me questions, and you and I have been through this, 18 times. And they'll still ask me questions. And I'm like, I don't know what you're asking me. Like, I literally don't like break that down into 8th grade language because I don't speak accounting. And then you're like, oh, okay. And then you get them the right information, So it can be a little bit intimidating to have that phone call, especially if it's your first one, because you almost feel embarrassed about what you do or don't know. But you don't have to know it all. Of course, that's why we have attorneys and accountants and property managers, because we know that we don't know it all. Yep. And we know we can't do it all. And so our job is to orchestrate or put together all those specialized individuals to make the whole machine run.
Makes sense. That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, so that's a really important phone call. And what we've actually done at Nighthawk is, now that we're running 13 different properties and we have 13 different syndications to prepare tax statements for at the end of each year, we're moving to a process where I have a phone call with our accountant. We don't know the exact cadence, but it might be every other month, just to check in on stuff. Yeah. Because there are things that are not important from a day-to-day bookkeeping perspective that are important from a tax perspective. And so your property manager might not stay on top of this topic, but your accountant wants it to be, very cleanly organized. And so by having those, that cadence of phone calls with our accountant, we're going to have cleaner taxes and more organized taxes going forward. Again, that's something learned the hard way, but that's something that we're going to be doing more and more of to make sure that it's just simpler and everyone's talking to each other within the organization.
That's great. So what you're trying to tell me, Drew, is that you don't just buy an asset and then just head to the beach, right? It's not just, you don't just sort of set it and forget it and dreams. You get your cold drink and sit on the beach, right? It's an ongoing business to manage.
You do not. Your investors get to be passive. You do not get to be passive, right? You get to be. You and I were talking about this like the other day over text, but the most unpassive business in my mind is like flipping homes. That just sounds like an absolute nightmare. I do not want to ever do that. So that is whole on non-passive active. Yeah. This is a step back from that because generally your property manager is taking care of toilets, tenants, and termites and all those little issues. But you still got to watch it and push it forward. This is a business where the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the property manager probably has 50 clients, right? And so they're managing the other ones. And so you got to sort of advocate for yourself. And what, the other phrase that's popular is what gets measured gets managed. So if you're measuring occupancy, if you're measuring collections, if you're measuring work orders, if you're measuring tenant turnover, and you talk about it, it's part of your regular cadence, your regular dialogue with your property manager, then they will know those are the important things for you, and they will start to behave that way. If you don't have that regular conversation, or if your phone calls are a little bit less structured, it's just like, oh, what's going on? Oh, the weather out there is nice. You placed a couple of new tenants. That sounds great. Like if it's not a structured conversation, it's a waste of everybody's time. And I've been guilty of leading unstructured calls, and I've been a part of calls where other people have led unstructured calls. And in the end, you've had, you've had 8 calls in the last 2 months, but you haven't really done anything because you haven't focused on certain key metrics, and you haven't forced the property manager to, tighten things up around important parts of your business. So that's probably a long-winded way of saying, absolutely, this is not a passive business. Your investors get to be passive. You get paid to push the ship forward and direct things and make sure it goes where you want it to go.
Yep, that makes sense. One of the things that we have found in doing our deals together is that there are property managers that are used to managing with syndicators, and syndicators have a different kind of demand in terms of reporting, in terms of managing distributions, working with lenders. And so just because they're a big property manager doesn't mean they have the same experience working with syndicators. Tell me about, Jonathan had a great question in the chat here. What are some of the primary KPIs, the key performance indicators that we want to sort of measure? Because there's 1,000 things to measure. What do you think are the most important in terms of executing your plan for your investors?
The number one KPI is occupancy, but from my perspective, it's not really occupancy. It's your sales generation funnel, right? So occupancy is the result of great sales generation. So how are your online advertisements? What's your drive-by flyers or bandit signs? How is your on-site staff managing phone calls? For every potential lead, what percentage of those become applicants? What percentage of applicants become tenants? So that funnel, everything that drives down to occupancy, is your number one thing that you need to keep your eye on and not outsource too heavily to your property management, because it's the lifeblood of your business. If your vendor management is phenomenal and your landscaping is beautiful and your units are gorgeous and you have the best attorney and the best accountant, but you don't have tenants filling units, you lose, right? And so that is where it starts there, and then everything else matters. But Drew, you and I have been a part of deals where the lead generation system lagged and occupancy sagged. And when we pushed on property management, hey, what are we going to do about this? It was sort of, the impression that I got was a little bit of a shoulder shrug and a, we'll wait to see if occupancy ticks back up. It was kind of like whatever the gods allow, like whatever descends from the clouds. And lo and behold, occupancy continued to dip down, and there wasn't a plan B. There wasn't a pivot on that deal. And that deal was doing badly, and it needed a change, and we've made a change to that, and we've sort of resurrected it. But my big takeaway from that was that on that one deal, but in general, is that that's one thing that you want to sort of watch like a hawk. And one way that we do watch that more nowadays is we hire professional shoppers to come in basically undercover, and they act like a regular tenant, and they score your property manager on a lot of different metrics. For the whole audience, the company that we've used is Ellis Company, ELLIS, and I think it was $300, and they will do a shop telephonically, so they'll call and see how many rings does it take to answer. And the whole thing is recorded, so you can, when you get the shop report, you'll get you'll listen to the whole 4 minutes or 18-minute phone call between the shopper and your property about, you'll listen to the whole phone call, how it went, how your salesperson did at sort of drawing them in and figuring out what their needs are and trying to bring them into, an on-site conversation, to tour a unit. And so we do that. And then I personally call myself sometimes. I'll just call the property, and I'll basically see, is anyone answering the phone call in the middle of the day? And sometimes they answer right away. I'm like, oh, sorry, wrong number. And I just hang up, right? Because I actually don't want to talk to my property manager. Or sometimes I'll go on to apartments.com and I'll inquire, hi, I'm looking for a unit, do you have any available? And I'll see, A, does anybody write me back? B, do they write me back fast? C, do they follow up when I don't respond to their initial email? And is it personalized, right? So that's all lead generation. That's conversion, right? So if they don't pick up the phone, or they pick up the phone, they never ask your name, or they're not energetic, over the course of 100 different inquiries, that level of energy and persistence will impact the conversion rate to applications and to tenants, and ultimately to revenue for you. So that's the number one thing that I look at is occupancy, but more fundamentally, the funnel leading to occupancy.
That's great. I think one of the neat things we've been able to do with that process is make sure that our pricing is consistent and our pictures are consistent, because it is amazing how many times our listings sort of get spread out to other .com sites, right? And you want to make sure that if your 2-bedroom says $800 on one site, it says $800 on every site, and that it's all consistent, and that the pictures are updated and the pictures are accurate and the sizing is correct. And so finding that uniformity amongst your digital assets is a really just important component to making sure that you're having a good experience, and making sure you kind of know where all your deals and your lead generations are coming from.
That's a big thing too, right? Is you're exactly right. In your property manager reporting, are they taking down notes on where your leads are coming from? So do you know that 75% of your tenants are resident referrals? Or are they all coming from Facebook or Craigslist or, Zillow, whatever it is? Like, do you know where your leads are coming from?
Yep.
And then you're exactly right. We have, there's something called indexing, right? Which is where you basically make sure that all of your exposure across the internet is uniform.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're changing the name of your property or you're changing your surroundings, that is a specialized skill set in itself. It's almost kind of like accounting. And one would love for a property manager to do that on their own, but I think it's pretty complex. And so sometimes you yourself, or you can hire an outside vendor to make sure that all of that is uniform across your business.
Right. Okay, let's pivot to the investor. So what is the investor experience like after you close? Like, we've been talking about sort of how the managing members engage with the legal, the accounting, the property managers. From an investor standpoint, what should they expect? What are the best ways, like a boss, to manage your investor base post closing?
So this is really important because you can't control how your property performs in the end. There's things that are just difficult, right? COVID hits and you can't evict tenants, whatever. One thing you can control 100% all of the time is how you communicate with your investors. That is within your control, right? And so if you neglect to do that, you are failing to control your variables well. And so that's one thing we at Nighthawk have sat down and talked about, like our the 3 promises of Nighthawk or something like that. And one of them is customer communication, because I can guarantee that, like, I can manage that 100%. So don't fail to do that. And as you and I know from coaching students, this business, I call it a 2-front war. The one front is finding the apartment building, and the other front is raising capital for the deal. So before close, that's the 2-front war. After you close, it continues to be a 2-front war. It's managing the asset and managing your investors. And so, I think some people might be more investor focused and some people might be more management focused, but if you don't do both, you lose, right? And so with regard to like good investor management, on the day you close, send out an email, hey, we closed. Like, they don't know. You're down in the weeds, you're signing documents or docu-signing things and wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So you certainly know, but you don't realize how much, you might not realize how much they're just sort of wondering if the deal ever closed. And so, again, there's been a deal where we didn't send out that email. Congratulations, you're now an owner in, 123 Main Street apartment buildings. And, a month later, you get an email from someone, and it's like, hey, did you ever close on that property? And you're like, oh, I didn't communicate that, right? That's very embarrassing. So make sure that you sort of, boast for a little bit and say, hey, we closed the property, on schedule. We said we were going to close on June 15th, and we closed on June 15th. You now own 1/5 of that property, right? Whatever it is. And then at that point in time, remind them, what is your plan? We plan to renovate all of the units or 1/3 of the units. We plan to put in new property management or fix the pool, whatever your plan is. This is our plan. You're basically going to, re-describe your offering memorandum. And then expectations regarding, when is our first distribution, that kind of stuff. So, take your time to sort of remind them of what's going on. Thank you for being an investor. And, I take the responsibility of being your custodian of your money very seriously. And we're fired up to do this, whatever it is. Right. And then of course we have monthly emails that go out to investors with, what's happened last month. But one thing we also have begun to do at Nighthawk is for the first 3 months after close, we have a webinar just like this with our investors. And it serves 2 functions. Number one, it shows them like logistically how we're going to go about managing them as investors. But number 2, it just makes sure that they see us, right? So like I forget the exact topics, but call number 1 is like, what is our financial expectations for the first year? Call number 2 is what are the information that we provide in our investor report? So it's like how to read our investor reports. And call number 3 is the investor portal that they use to get investor statements, tax statements, basically all their information, right? It's kind of like when you log on to E-Trade, it's like that. And it's important information, but it's also just an excuse to get in front of them, to have a chance to do a Q&A, just like we're going to do in a little bit, and make sure that we're not like, as much as we can, get to know our investors and make sure that they feel comfortable that we're doing everything we can to sort of advance, their interests with their investments.
That's great. That is awesome information, Drew. So talk to me about sort of on an ongoing basis. You obviously have phone calls. You have communication with your investors. How important is it post-purchase to get on site, regardless of the level of communication? How often should someone be visiting? Should they be visiting at all? What's the advantages and the pros and cons of being physically on site the property?
Got to do it. And a rookie mistake that you and I have learned, Drew, in the past is not doing it, right? So you and I, when we both lived in the same state, we invested within a couple miles of our house. That's easy. We could go over there after work and see the property, which is ideal. That's phenomenal. If you find properties you can syndicate where you live, number one, you can see it. And number two, you can probably pitch the deal to people that you live nearby or work with. And it's easier to invest in a property that you can see than a property 2,000 miles away. So that's great. But if you do invest a plane flight away, then should you take the time and expense to go see the property? And the answer is yes, right? Because as great as Zoom or phone calls are, nothing replaces going to see your property, right? Mm-hmm. And I can think of a property that you and I have done together, Drew, that if we had gone to see the property earlier on, especially in the first 6 months of ownership, we would have realized there was a problem and made a property management switch faster and saved ourselves many checks that you and I wrote into the asset that were expensive, right? Yeah. Because the fact is, someone can charm you and fool you a little bit over the phone, and it's harder to do that in person. So when you go to your property, either announced or unannounced, right, so that they're surprised, and you walk the units, you see stuff that you simply won't see or learn about if you have a 30-minute phone call and they say everything's great. It makes a big difference.
Yep.
So seeing the property is worthwhile, and the cadence of it matters, right? So at Nighthawk, we, especially on some of our properties there's a lot more things in motion. We're in the renovation process. Some of those properties, we have our asset manager on site every month, in some months twice a month. So we spend a lot of money doing that, but we have learned that it's money well spent because you find out problems early on and you can pivot and make solutions early on, right?
Yep.
And you see how responsive they are. So if you say, hey, property management, we need to get whatever new flower beds out in front of the leasing office to make it look nice. Can we make that done? And they say yes. Then when next visit, if it's done, they're responsive. If it's not, and you kind of nag them, that's a bummer, right? You don't want to be nagging the PM. You want them to be executing.
Right. That's great. That's fantastic. It can be hard to decide. Obviously you're measuring the performance of the property purely by numbers, right? It's always tempting to say, is every dollar spent have a direct NOI? And sometimes it's hard to gauge that. Sometimes it's hard to gauge what does it look like to have a little bit of better grass and some flowers out in front? What does it look like to have just a little bit of a better experience for the tenants? How do you think about the experience for your tenants versus purely just hammering on numbers and expenses each month? How do you sort of think through items that may not have a direct NOI impact on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis, but there are things that have overall for the quality of your tenants and for the experience and the operations of your property manager? Yeah.
Super good question. Super hard question to answer because we don't have a great answer for that. It's a moment where you're driving more by, I don't know if the word is gut or instinct, but you can't drive by numbers. And for you and me, we're really comfortable running things by numbers, right? But I think part of it is if you're trying to improve a property, you're trying to sort of fundamentally reposition it from, a C class asset to a C plus class asset. What needs to happen to make that pivot? And it's not just buying toilet paper or whatever, it has to be something a little bit more fundamental, probably aesthetic, probably a cultural shift with your property management And those things are beyond numbers. So you and I talked a lot about things like painting the exterior of the buildings. If you have a leasing office, like making that leasing office look and smell and appear nice. Those don't directly increase rents, but they have a little bit more of a, ooh, I like this place kind of feel to it, right? And so I just think on some level you have to, I don't know if I don't like to say drive or make the decisions by gut, but you have to sort of say, step back and say fundamentally, what do I want this property to think and feel and be like, and what's feasible, and then go toward that with conviction. Yeah, so absolutely. That's my best. It's a tough one to answer, but that's how I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that we've learned is how important the reputation is of your property in the neighborhood, the reputation that it has with the tenants and with its neighbors. And you think that there's this great formula. All you have to do is invest a certain amount of money and put in some new flooring, and tenants will be happy to turn over more money, and new tenants will come streaming in the door. And so I think reputation management takes time to change. Reputation with your current tenant base, reputation with the neighborhood, and sometimes the name of your property comes with some strings attached related to, it probably has been there a while. And so sometimes we've done some name changes, sometimes we've kept them the same. And sometimes we really want to provide some different feels. And so we make investments in the community. And so I can think of, there's two things that you and I have done recently that I think have a lot of value to the tenant base, value to help establish rapport and reputation with the property managers and on site. One of those is a property that you and I just owned together. We recently bought during this COVID. We just spent some money with a local restaurant, and we bought a rib dinner for everyone in our 68 unit building. There's no ROI on that, right? There's no direct ROI that says if we do this, tenants will happily pay more for rent. But what it does is it creates a great relationship between the tenants and the on-site staff. It helps create some level of community involvement. So sort of community feel that we're not just creating sort of a filing cabinet for humans, we're creating a community and a place that people can call home. Talk about what Nighthawk has done with apartment life. Why is that valuable? Why is that something you want to pursue as a strategy within these properties?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions. So your tenants, we forget about our tenants. Like, they are our primary clients, right? Like Target Corporation they have a laser focus on what their tenant or what their customer experience should be like. And there's a whole lot of other people with boxes, apartment units that have toilets and bedrooms and locks in the front. So how do you differentiate yourself from all those other people selling apartment units that are essentially widgets and be a go-to place? That's essentially the question that you're asking. And so whether it's the rib dinners that we're buying or what Nighthawk is doing with apartment life, we're trying to make this more than simply a box to live in, right? We want to make it more of a feeling. So there's an organization that we at Nighthawk love called Apartment Life, and they are a nonprofit organization that exists to create communities with, deep, meaningful relationships between the people living there in apartment complexes, right? And so they cost a little bit of money, but they have a phenomenal amount of programming. They provide like after-school tutoring. They throw barbecues. They have welcome packets for when tenants come into properties. If a tenant is sick and is in the hospital, they'll go to the hospital. They'll help people if someone's car isn't working, drive them to work. All those little like neighborly things they do to try to create that community within your property. And so we have them either on or plan to go on, I think on site about 4 properties right now. And we get monthly reports about the events that they're doing. Phenomenal stuff. And I think very it's not expected in apartment complexes, but when you do it, it's a great wow factor that makes a difference. And if a tenant's like, oh, maybe I'll move, or maybe I'll stay here where they really like look after me and my child gets some tutoring, that's a big differentiator. And it reduces turnover a lot. So one other function they do is they have access, or they have ability to look into the future and see when your expected vacating tenants are, and they will work on those tenants to try to sort of close them and have them on site, so they reduce turnover as well. So that's one thing we do, right? Like it's a little bit hard to tie that NOI back, but it's totally worthwhile in our opinion.
I think turnover is one of those hidden expenses that are really hard to quantify, even with the most robust financial data. If you had a property that maintained a 95% occupancy for the last 2 years, the metric you don't have in there is what percentage of your tenants probably turned over. You could do some lease analysis maybe to get to that, but even on a brand new property, brand new A-class property, you're still going to have a normal amount of turnover, and that turnover takes vacancy when the tenant isn't there. You have to pay utilities when there's not a tenant in there. And even a brand new property is going to need a little bit of cleaning and refresh and a little touch up and paint. And so in any ways that you can reduce turnover can create a huge amount of expense reduction on your property. And that's done by people wanting to stay and wanting to get to renew their lease and having good relationships and proactive management on the property management side. So all those components really can help into sort of start stripping out that consistency. And that's one of the things that you and I have noticed in this property that we own together. It's a C, probably maybe a C minus asset, right? It is not there's nothing. It is nothing special. We have no amenities, but we have very, very little turnover. And I think some of the things that we've done to create that sense of community and create that sense of ownership and management engagement has really led to a phenomenally low turnover rate for the tenant base. I'm sort of shooting from the hip here on this, Drew, but typically we see turnover in the 30, 40, sometimes 50% range. And I think we're seeing stuff significantly lower than that. And so that's a really good long-term investment. And some of the things you talked about really helps create some good value for the tenants and translate to good long-term ownership for the investors.
Yeah. My analogy on vacancy and especially turnovers is it's like when you were in school and you did pretty well in all your homework assignments, but then every once in a while you'd forget to turn one in and you get a 0 on it. And the mathematical drag on your overall grade from a couple zeros takes your class grade from a B plus to a C minus or a solid C, right? You get a huge drag from a couple zeros. So if you have those few vacant units or you have the turnovers where there's 1 month of vacancy, it has a huge impact on your overall cash flow. It's a big thing. And so you're right. Anything you can do to keep loyal tenants is worthwhile. Another KPI to manage, to go back to that question from the chat room, is work orders and average days outstanding of work orders. Because if a tenant doesn't have hot water or their lock doesn't work or their windows are drafty and it doesn't get addressed, they get pissed. It's like I'm paying money for this apartment and you're not fixing X, Y, or Z for me. And they ought to be frustrated. So if you can timely respond to those things, they will want to stay, because a lot of other apartment owners won't timely respond to them and they don't want to take a risk and go over there and not have their stuff be addressed. So looking at those work orders and getting them addressed quickly will have an impact, very good impact upon your tenant turnover, having that come down, and ultimately your cash flow.
That's fantastic. That's great. We had a question here. You mentioned a property, you would have made a property management switch had you have visited after closing. I'm wondering though, wouldn't you have already walked the property once it's under contract and your due diligence? And what kind of things would key you into property management issues when you're on site? Great question. You want to take that, or do you? Yeah,
I mean that happened. 15 months ago. And one thing I would say, Drew, is that apartment buildings age in dog years. So 15 months ago feels like 15 years ago for me.
Yep.
So I'm trying to remember exactly what all the details were. But one thing I know, Drew, if I remember correctly, you need to help me here. But we went to the property. We went there. We sat down with the property manager in his office, and the more we sort of asked deeper questions and kind of looked at him across the table, the more we realized that he was in over his head. As far as I think we knew that because the questions weren't being answered in a very sophisticated way.
Yep.
And one of the things I think we learned on that visit was that this property manager, who had been recommended to us by someone else, actually this was the largest property they managed at 68 units, and the bulk of their portfolio was like 4plexes and maybe an 8plex. And so just the sophistication of managing a property like that is a different sport than managing 4plexes. And we didn't realize that this was outside of their circle of competence until we were down there. So I think that was part of it. And then obviously we just saw that the numbers were flagging a lot. What else did we see that helped us realize that this wasn't the right person to get us where we wanted to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. One was our weekly calls were like, things are going great. We are so excited. The neighborhood loves the changes. So we sort of got a little bit more lip service. But when we show up at the property, we would see things that it didn't look as good as they were describing it, right? There was, and one of the things that we know is that if if your property manager sort of walks by your on-site manager walks by a piece of garbage, by the third time they walk past it, they don't see it anymore, right? So you need a fresh lens to say, look, this needs to get trimmed. Some of the things that we saw when we went there ourselves was like, wow, this building just needs to be pressure washed. Like, we just need to clean up all the cobwebs and some of the mold on the exterior. We visited it at night, and our property manager wasn't there at night, and it was dark. And it was kind of like a U-shaped or almost a circle-shaped asset, and it was dark at night. And so by walking it at night, we said, look, let's just take out all of the unit lights and replace them with nice, clean, consistent LED boxes, and it really lit it up and it made it feel nice and warm. So we ended up having things that sort of really were visual indicators that they weren't keeping track of things. It was only by sort of being there on site, talking with the tenants, that we sort of got a real sense of like maybe things aren't going as
trash was piling up.
Trash was piling up. Yep. We made the news. We try to stay out of the news. That's the number one rule.
We made the news in the wrong way on that one.
Yeah. Question for Megan: Do you do periodic drive-bys or go shopping of your property managers? If so, how do you do that? I think that's kind of a question on the asset management side. I think there's usually a time when you want to announce when you're going to be there because you need to have people on site. You need the regional manager on site. You need to be able to be prepared for meetings. And then sometimes you want to show up without telling them or have other people drive the property. What's the advantages, Drew, to having someone show up unannounced?
Yeah, so the unannounced visit, in my experience, happens less often than the announced visit because practically the announced visit, you want to meet with them, you want to have access to units, you want to talk about X, Y, or Z, you want to talk to the landscaping vendor. And so in order to set up meetings, obviously you're announcing that you're there. So if you're going to do the unannounced visit, you have to be willing to accept that you may not get to meet with people, right? So that's a trade-off. But the unannounced visit, the benefit of that is you're seeing it how it truly is on a day-to-day basis. You might show up at 9, 10 in the morning and no one is at the leasing office yet. So they're 10 minutes late, for example. Or the grounds, there's trash all over the grounds. They're not picked up. Whereas, of course, if they know you're coming, they're probably going to pick up the trash the day before so that it looks really clean. So those are the kind of things is you get to sort of see it in its organic, unfiltered state by going unannounced to see the property. And so that's very valuable. We've done that in the past. There's been times where one of the other GPs was going to be in that town for work. And so they just swung by and took photographs and sent them back to everyone on the team. And you're like, oh, looks bad, or something like that. So that's the value of the unannounced visit. It happens less often than the announced visit, but it can be very valuable.
Jonathan hit us with a bunch of questions here. How often should you go? How many units should you walk? And what are you looking at during these visits? And this gets into a little bit more. Next week, we're going to have Daniel Simpson, who's the asset manager for Nighthawk. We'll kind of go through some of these pieces, but at a high level, Drew, what would you expect in terms of how often to visit, what you should see, and kind of what are you looking for?
Yeah, you go more often, number one, in the beginning of your purchase, and number two, when there's more things going on, and usually those two coincide, right? So if you're renovating a lot of units, or if there's a lot of exterior renovation, you need to watch that more carefully, right? And so that requires more visits because what gets seized gets managed, or what gets watched gets managed, right? So you're going to go there more often to do those things and make sure that it's going in the right direction. Once the property is stabilized and normalized, and there's not kind of too many moving parts, it's less important to go there because there's not that much stuff to check up on. Yep. So the frequency of visits is a function of the amount of things taking place at the property. So that's a frequency. How often do you look at units? Drew, the last time you and I visited that property, there were no units to walk because, 100% of them were full, right? So we could have looked at inside a tenant's unit, but they were there wasn't much to look at. So I think you want to look at units, you might want to look at a unit in 2 different visits on a pre-renovation and post-renovation basis. So how much did we change it? How much did it cost? Can your property manager articulate the exact amount that it cost? Like, are they like, oh, it was about $3,000? Or are they like, here are your 18 receipts for parts and labor? That shows you how capable they are, right? And then how well was it done, right? Like, is there paint dripping on the trim, right? Is there paint dripping onto the carpet? Like, was the countertop installed well? You want to have a fine eye for that, right? Like, is the toilet solidly on the floor, right? Yep. So you want to walk those units and see how well they're done. Yep. So that would be how often I visit and what I would look for when I visit. Was there a third question there, Drew?
That's pretty much it. Well, I mean, it was how often. I think how often is, right away in terms of right after acquisition, you want to see it a few times. And it does have a difference whether you're switching property managers or not, right? When you acquire an asset, sometimes you keep the old property manager, sometimes you get a new one, and those will have different ownership transition processes.
Yeah, you'd like to keep the existing property management because it's just less turbulence, right? Like, whenever there's change, there's an opportunity for things to get dropped. Yeah. But oftentimes, I mean, I think 80% of the time, there's a PM change when a property gets purchased. That's my observation.
What anything else, Drew, from our list of items you wanna hit? This has been phenomenal. This has been absolutely great to sort of get the sort of peek under the hood at what some of the things that Nighthawk has been doing and just sort of general experiences from what you've had of managing these multifamily assets. Anything else?
One thing I was thinking about while we were talking is when we buy a property, it's like the world to us. What we've been focusing on and raising money for and sort of dreaming of for a long time, right? So when we buy a property and even when there's property management switch, it's a huge deal to us. But just think from a tenant's perspective, they don't know that the property traded hands. They don't know that it changed title, and they don't care, or they don't know what it means, right? It's still like that classy building down the way in town, right? And so to the extent that in your mind, you're going to change the reputation of this property and make it shine and make it perform better in 6 months is probably just not going to happen, because it only changes financially to the extent that it changes in the mindset of the tenants and the community around it. Mm-hmm. And they don't think about apartment buildings 10 hours a day like we do, right? They just live in it and go on with their lives. And so those changes happen slowly by careful attention and hopefully by wowing your tenants with, concern for their well-being and looking after them, right? And so this stuff takes time. That was my big thought is tenants don't think about this stuff like we think about it, but ultimately we don't win until their mindset changes and they don't leave the building or they're willing to pay more so that we produce more value. And so these things just do take time, and we can all be a little bit impatient wanting to have results. But it's consistency, not over months, but over years, that will get you there. And so stay consistent and stay focused, and don't, chase the shiny object or lose hope too early when you acquire property. It takes time to execute on your plan.
That's wonderful. That's awesome. Drew Kniffin, thank you so much. If people have questions, how do they get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Email address is drew@nighthawkequity.com. And we do, we were talking about investor relations, we always get back to our investors within 24 hours, and we try to do it within 1 hour to any question they get. And I try to respond to your questions in the same kind of way.
That's wonderful. Thanks for doing that, Drew. That's it. I think that's all the kind of time we allocated for this. Thanks for taking time, Drew, and we appreciate it. And this, for anyone who's watching, we're going to be reposting this in all of our Like a Boss series will get reposted, so you'll have access to all the conversations we've had during this series. So thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Hold on a second, Drew.